She asked me for my definition of enlightenment. And I said, enlightenment means that you can live in an ethical and loving way, no matter the circumstances. And she said, what? I've never heard anything about ethics. Among all of the people who I've interviewed many Buddhist teachers. None of them have said that. Do you have anything to substantiate this absurd claim? She was mad. She was actually angry on the call. And I said, well, yes, I have a great deal to substantiate that. The Buddhist sutras, all of our entire tradition I have to support this. And her reasoning was clear. She stated explicitly. She said, no, enlightenment means that you can be happy independent of conditions. How you behave are just conditions. So Buddhism, the purpose of Buddhism is to be sure that you can be happy even while you're doing bad things.
Thank you so much. When we talk about first principles and first values, which in some sense the ancient world talked about as Torah or as Tao or as Dharma, we're not actually engaging only the mechanics of cosmos, although there are structural laws to cosmos. There are laws of love. There are laws of Eros. But we're engaging the music of cosmos. There are first principles and first values. And there's a reason not to just use the words Dharma or Torah or the Tao or the Logos, right? Or Mat or Geist, right? Or the implicate order, right? Or Atman is Brahman, because all of those words are Gaia. All of those words are problematic. All of them are missing things that are really important. There's a deep sense in which all of those words have a pre-tragic sense. They have a sense of certainty about the way things are. The pre-tragic is certain. It's certain about the way. It's certain about the destination. It's certain about the no destination. And when we move from the pre-tragic to the tragic, we embrace the void. We embrace the uncertainty. We dance in the doubt. We're challenged by new views of cosmos, which are vast, over vast stretches of time. We're challenged by a much deeper and profound understanding of the inherent scientific structures of reality. We become aware of suffering at scales that are vast and unimaginable, and don't allow us to dismiss suffering as Thornton Wilder did in his book, Bridge Over the St. Louis Ray, by explaining that it all worked out perfectly for everybody. That's certainly not true within one dimension. We need a wider lens. The understandings of modernity and post-modernity are real, and they need to be taken seriously. That's the tragic. And then we move from the tragic to the post-tragic. We re-embrace the Tao, the eternal Tao. But we realize the eternal Tao is the evolving Tao. We re-embrace the radical certainties. But we realize that the certainties are not only that it is true, the certainties are that I am true and that I participate in the field of value. We realize that the realization of true self is not only a realization of awareness. That's a mistaken notion of true self. We understand that the realization of true self is that I am not just indivisible from the field of awareness in which I participate, but it's Sat, Chit, Ananda, it's Eros awareness, it's Eros value. It's Eros value desire all the way up and all the way down in the manifest universe, and I'm universe. I'm one with all of that. We realize that evolution becomes conscious in a new way. Evolution is always conscious, but there's a new dimension of consciousness that shifts as we enter into the Anthropocene, where human beings are the agents of the manifest that affect the future more than anything or anyone else. And when we realize that we actually have the power to destroy the whole thing in a way that we never did, and then we realize that actually there's almost an inherent inevitability to that destruction, unless actually evolution does what it always potentially can do. It takes a momentous leap. Unless something new emerges, we realize that the natural course is crisis, and that crisis leads to a kind of deadening of aliveness, to a kind of suicide. And that suicide is not only in mental breakdown and loneliness around the world, there's a planetary suicide that's potential in the offing. And we realize that we can only respond to that planetary suicide the same way we respond to personal suicide. An actual reclaiming of the infinite, dancing, gorgeous Eros value, the field of Eros meaning in which I participate, the knowing that it all matters. It's not just matter. Matter itself is made up of what matters. It's what matters. It's significant. It's wildly significant, all the way up and all the way down the evolutionary chain. All of it everywhere. We don't need to search for purpose, because purpose is not hard to find. It's impossible to avoid. This purposeless purpose of reality. Wow. It's so insanely gorgeous to be with y'all and to be together and to be in this unfolding that we're doing. So what I want to try and do in the next short amount of time is I'm going to kind of set up this conversation. I'm going to turn then the microphone to my dear friend, who's both a board member at the center, but also just a very, very close and dear friend. And we're deepening every day, to my dear friend, Soryu Forall, who is both a neighbor here in Vermont, but also a neighbor in the Celestial Academy. Right? And we are deeply joined, myself and Soryu and Zach. And we are in response to this moment in time. And just like the center is an activist think tank and community, right, which is around the globe that's in response to the meta crisis, telling a new story of value, Soryu has engaged the meta crisis, right? He's seen much of what we've seen through his own particular and unique and gorgeous perspective and his own quality of intimacy and his own engaged presence. And he, like we developed the think tank and community in response to the meta crisis, he founded his monastic academy, deeply ensconced in Buddhist and other lineages, right, in response to the meta crisis. So the monastic academy, like the Center for World Philosophy and Religion, are in direct response to the meta crisis. And what we both understand is that what we would call a new story of value, Soryu will talk about, right, in terms of his own terms, right view, is utterly essential in response to the meta crisis. That is to say, it's insufficient to fix technology, although we need to fix technology, which is infrastructure. It's insufficient to pass kind of new laws and new regulations, right? And, have new educational reforms in the kind of most general social structure sense. That won't take us home. We actually need new superstructure. We need a new story of value. A story of value, right view. And it's only from that new story of value that anything ever changes. And that new story of value is always a story of inherent value and inherent meaning. Now, I want to try and frame this for a second. And then, David's going to read a code, and then we're going to turn to Soryu. And I want to frame this in terms of the conversations we've been having, right, in these several weeks. And let me try and frame it as follows. So we've engaged a particular thinker, Yuval Harari, in a conversation, although the conversation has been somewhat one-sided, but that's okay. We'll talk about that in a second. And we engaged Yuval not for him particularly, although mad blessings to him. I wrote Yuval a long personal letter, as I talked about last week. And, when he's been attacked on threads, right, in a way that was inappropriate or demonizing, I've posted at least 20 posts telling people cut it out, right? My premise is that evil is a beautiful, wonderful man, right? And that, his intent is not a bad faith intent, right? It's a good faith intent. And that we need to engage in a fierce contestation, a fierce conversation, but a conversation between beloveds, a conversation between friends. And just notice the subtlety of it. In other words, on the one hand, I think that Yuval has diagnosed the meta crisis in a way that's similar to myself and similar to Soryu, and similar to my friend Daniel and to Zach and to other colleagues of ours. In a kind of general sense, there's a general similar diagnosis, not in terms of what's causing it, but in terms of kind of the technologies, the contributions of technology and what the structures of the breakdown are, right? And as we understand very differently than Yuval what its ultimate source is, but we all understand there's a meta crisis that's real. Yuval's diagnosed that well, and yet Yuval is representing the voice in the zeitgeist, which is the mainstream voice, right? It's a voice that sold 50 million copies because it resonates with the mainstream of policymakers around the world who have all kind of endorsed this vision. And at the core of the vision is, as I said last week, right, any quote, any meaning that you ascribe to your life is a mere delusion. Any meaning you ascribe to your life is mere delusion. That's Sapiens, Homo Deus, meaning and value are the same. I'm using those identically. Yuval's very clear about that. So any value you ascribe to your life, 275 to 278 Nexus, same basic idea. Children's books, Unstoppable Us, same basic idea. Last 2 chapters of 21 Questions, same basic idea, right? Time after time, right? And other than, when Yuval's asked at a kind of TED Talk interview, right, what's the purpose of human beings, right? He cleverly says nothing, and everyone laughs, and it's not a good laughter. So I want to get this. It's a big deal. So we've taken a very, very sharply challenging stance in response not to Yuval, but to that which he's parroting, voicing in the zeitgeist. But we're doing it not in a demonizing way. That's bullshit. There's no room for that. We're doing it to actually participate in what we call here the conversational cosmos. Cosmos is a love story, and love stories have conversations. Cosmos has an ontology of threaded action, right? Plot line, but at the core is conversations. There's a series, Cosmos is a series of conversations. And the conversations begin at the level of quarks, which there's actually exchanged value and information from the perspective of science, and at the level of chemistry, right? And enzymes. An enzyme is a conversation. If you really know what an enzyme is, it's a conversation. A neuropeptide is a conversation, right? So there are languages, right, that go all the way down. And then language bursts into a new level of ontology with the emergence of the human being. And then as language emerges to a new level of ontology, so does meaning and value and stories of value. And in order to respond to the meta crisis, what we need to do is to re-edit, right, to re-narrate, to reclaim, right, the broken plot lines in the story of modernity and postmodernity. Now, we've talked about all this, okay? I want to add one piece now. We'll read the code and we'll turn to Soryu because I'm interested in a particular piece. So we've invited Yuval to this conversation. We've invited Yuval to this conversation in a big way. We've said, okay, right, we're going to engage this like we do in the study hall. We're going to actually, right, in a fierce way, wield Manjushri's sword, if I can use a Buddhist image, in honor of my friend Soryu. We're going to wield Manjushri's sword. We're going to slice through, right, superficial arguments and claims that there is no value and there's no meaning, and actually not go back to the old Tao, to the old Torah, right, to the old Dharma, but actually transcend, right, all that came before, include it, and actually generate, as evolution always does, this new emergent, which is this this new, deeper vision of value and meaning that's post-tragic, that can actually become the basis of a shared grammar of value, rooted in first principles and first values that are real, that are backed by the universe, right? That articulate a new story of value. It's only a new story of value, of meaning. It's only meaning and value that change the vector of history that will allow us to avoid unbearable suffering. Now, that's all meta, and that's a conversation that we've had here so deeply on so many levels. And Soryu and I are deep in this conversation with Zach and with, right? And we're going to have this coming June, the second to last weekend in June. We're going to be doing an entire seminar. It's the third one. And in general, we're going to be doing twice a year, right? Seminars enacting this new vision of a world religion, right? A world philosophy, a world religion as a context for our diversity. We're going to be doing together with the Monastic Academy. And so the third week in June will be at the Monastic Academy. The fourth week will be here at our center in Vermont. So that's all in play. But now we're going to focus very specifically. Okay, so I want to now take everybody, if we can. Now, Yuval, you're invited to the conversation, brother. We're waiting for you. Okay, let's do this. And don't avoid, Yuval, brother, don't avoid the conversation. Right? Step in. We're not going to joust. We're going to actually look for meaning together. Let's take this on. The tragedy, the utter tragedy, right, of COVID was that the conversation broke down at a deeper level than it ever had before. And I spoke to a guy named Steve Kirsch on the phone. Steve may be listening. Steve is an entrepreneurial kind of tech figure. And, Steve said, hey, I'll put up $1 million, right, if the center can bring together, right, the anti-vax position in regard to the COVID vax, the best science people, with the pro-vax position, right? And he knew that this is something that we deeply wanted to do because the conversation had broken down. And I tried with my friend, Dr. Vinay Julapalli, right, who's a cardiologist in Texas and Houston, and we could not bring both sides of the conversation together, even to an off-the-record, non-recorded conversation where we would use Kirsch's funds to send everyone, $25,000, take off a week, come down, we'll fly you down, right? Give it towards your favorite charity. Let's have this conversation. And then let's share the result of the conversation with the world to actually guide us. That conversation did not happen any place in the world. The conversation broke down. When the conversation breaks down, the meta crisis explodes and catastrophic risk and existential risk fulfill themselves. So we have to have conversation. Okay, so Yuval, brother, we're inviting a conversation deeply. Okay, so now I want to go particularly to our topic today. So I want to just give you a couple of quotes which just set up this conversation. So in other words, Yuval's actually not just claiming that value is not real and meaning is not real, that there is no meaning or value in reality at all. Any of it's just a delusion. He's saying that's the teaching of the Buddha. That's the teaching of Buddhism, and particularly through his lineage teacher, Goenka, Goenke. And I want to just give you a couple of quotes. All right. Quote one. So these are direct quotes. The universe has no meaning. Right? He's saying this is what ancient Buddhism is saying. He's saying Buddhism is saying, quote, the universe has no meaning, and human feelings too carry no meaning. They're just ephemeral vibrations appearing and disappearing for no particular purpose. That's the truth. Get over it. That's the quote. So it's kind of this kind of macho Buddhist position ascribed to Buddhism. Right? Now, I've read somewhat deeply in the first, second, and third turning of the wheel in Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana Buddhism. It's very clear to me that that's not what Buddhism is saying, but that's not for me to say because I'm not an initiate. I'm not a master in that tradition. And Soryu began talking about both Buddhism in particular in his teaching, right, and particularly about the lineage, right, of Goenka that Yuval is ascribing himself to, which is particularly important. And I want everyone to get the significance of this cultural move because the key Buddhist teachers in the West, right, many of them come directly from Goenka. and not by coincidence, right? The Spirit Rock people, the Insight and Meditation Society of Bar, Massachusetts people, some of the key gang, right, are mediated through in a number of countries in Europe, other places, right? South Africa, right? Are this Goenka lineage of interpreting Buddhism became very important. And Soryu said some incredibly important things about both Buddhism itself, Harari's misreading of it, and particularly this lineage that were all, right, unbelievably important. And so I asked him immediately, I said, it would be so fabulous just to hear this and to share this, right, with the community in the context of this conversation as a profound brother who I love madly. It's very rare, if I can say, that a person takes on at a certain point a new, deep, real personal friend. It's very hard to do. And that's what we've both done. So I love the man madly, but that's insufficient here, right? I love what he's saying madly. It's so insanely important. So let me just give you one more quote, just so we get the Buddhism quotes that are the context that occasioned this particular one mountain. So he goes on and to kind of quote the Buddha. He says, the Buddha taught, right, that the three basic realities of the universe are that everything's changing, right? Nothing has any enduring essence, and nothing is completely satisfying. So far that's good, right? Or could be good. But then he goes to the next step, and he says, according to the Buddha, what he takes out of this, what emerges for him, according to the Buddha, then life has no meaning. Life has no meaning. Unless you get confused by someone like Viktor Frankl in his famous book, Man's Search for Meaning, where Frankl says we have to create meaning, and he starts a school called logotherapy. He says, no, life has no meaning, and people don't need to create any meaning. They just need to realize that there is no meaning. And therefore, he says, that's liberation from suffering. The realization that there's no meaning. And then he cites the Buddha again, right, in this very kind of, right, and this is part of this broader postmodern Buddhist alignment in the West. They both come together and kind of affirm together, right, meaninglessness. And so Buddhism has been hijacked as this authority for postmodernism. He says the Buddha advises do nothing, absolutely nothing. That's enough. It's great to be with everyone. Welcome, 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 welcome. Take it away, David.
Yeah, great to be here. And if you're new, we resonate the code every week, which is kind of like the orientation of where we're going here. This is our focal point. So really take this down. This is Dr. Marc's code here. So this week's evolutionary love code. Meaning is real. Real means backed by the universe, the inherent nature of reality before space and time. Value is real. Value is backed by the universe. It's not true that value is co-primordial with space and time. Value is prior to space and time. All of reality, including space and time, arises in the field of value. I'll do it one more time. Meaning is real. Real means backed by the universe, the inherent nature of reality before space and time. Value is real. Value is backed by the universe. It is not true that value is co-primordial with space and time. Value is prior to space and time. All of reality, including space and time, arises in the field of value.
Thank you. That's our code. We're here, poised between utopia and dystopia, in this time between worlds, this time between stories. We're getting together. This is the revolution. We're articulating the new field of meaning in response to the meta crisis, and we're living it. We're being it. We participate in it. Right? With great delight, I turn to my brother, Buddhist master, teacher, transmitter, right, builder of institutions, cultural provocateur, and wonderful, gorgeous human, right, Soryu. Take it away, holy brother. Deep bell.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you, for taking care of the world. It is a beautiful world, and we love it so much, and it takes courage to live that way. So yes, right now I'm at the Monastic Academy, where we base our lives in the teachings of the Buddha. And we are very concerned about existential risks. And I want to begin by reading a critique of the Monastic Academy that was just brought to my attention. So this is a critique of what we do from a Buddhist perspective, from the Western post-colonial Buddhist perspective. So this is in a thread online that is discussing concerns about what we're doing, and this is the main point made in this particular thread. They seem oddly fixated on artificial intelligence and saving the world from existential risks. That's in quotations. Existential risks. Not something that is emphasized in most Buddhist schools. To me, this is conflating Dharma with worldly aims and is dangerously close to doomsday territory. So when I bring Buddhism to the issue of the meta crisis, of existential risks, one of the main responses that Western post-colonial Buddhists give is that you should not conflate relative with absolute truth. You should keep them apart. You should not bring the Dharma to the world situation. And the question arises, is this, in fact, emphasized in most Buddhist schools? Is this a normal thing that we're doing, or is it an unusual thing that we're doing? So it's a good question. Is worrying about destroying life something that the Buddha advised? Is living a life that takes care of all beings something that the Buddha taught? This is a very deep question right now. And Buddhism has been, well, maligned in recent decades and in recent centuries. Please note that the very beginning of Buddhism is ethical practice. And the very beginning of ethical practice is panatipata vedamani sikkhapadam samadhiyami, which means I commit as a part of my spiritual path to learn from the practice of not destroying life. It's put very simply as I commit to not destroying life, the non-destruction of life. In the Buddha's own time, he was engaged in issues that were occurring at the level of destruction of life at the time. So the burning down of wild areas. He was concerned about major social issues, such as the caste system, something in which he made real sacrifices. The Sangha, the congregation, received considerable attacks because he and they took a stand against the racist practices that were growing at the time and, in fact, have continued to this day. He was the first person that I know of in world history to create an organization of women, for women, by women, governed by women, not by the monks and the Sangha. And a great deal of violence was directed at the Sangha because he made that choice. These are enormous social issues that he was engaged in. And most important is this point around right view. He offered people right view. And I'd like to, at some length, read what he said about this. I want to begin with this issue about ethical conduct and then go into how should you look at the world? What's the right way to understand reality? Right view means what's the right way, what is the correct way to understand reality? And so this is quoting from the Majjhima Nikaya. The Buddha says, and how householders, so now he's not speaking to monastics, he's speaking to the lay population. It's not that he says something different to the monastics, but in this, I chose this because these are the same groups that, say, Harari is talking to. And how householders is their bodily conduct that is not in accord with the Dharma. In other words, unrighteous conduct. Here, someone kills living beings. He is murderous, given to violence, merciless to living beings. So that's the very beginning of the wrong way to live. There's much more said, but we're going to skip to right view because we have such limited time today. And how householders is their mental conduct not in accord with the Dharma, unrighteous conduct of mind. Here, and then he goes through this issue of covetousness, coveting the wealth or property of others, or he has a mind of ill will or intentions of hate. Then he comes to wrong view, distorted vision. And this is what the Buddha says is incorrect, the wrong way to look at things. There is nothing given, nothing offered, nothing sacrificed, no fruit or result of good and bad action. No this world, no other world, no mother, no father, no beings who are reborn spontaneously, no good and virtuous philosophers and priests in the world who have themselves realized by direct knowledge and correctly declare this world and the other world. Now I'm going to go through this slowly because this has been removed from Western post-colonial Buddhism. And that creates a tradition, I'm sorry to say, that is quite dangerous. As much as I love Buddhism, the form that we have now, while it's doing a great deal of good, is doing some harm as well. So we have this claim, there is nothing given. Well, that's wrong. The Buddha later in the same text, he's absolutely clear. That there is what is given. There is what is offered. There is what is sacrificed. That means that you can perform heroic deeds. You can offer yourself. It makes a difference. It changes the world. It has meaning to do that. So many people think, well, I could do something, I could help this person, but it's not really going to matter. It matters if you do that. And it matters if you don't do that. When you sacrifice, something beautiful comes into the world that wouldn't have been there if you hadn't sacrificed. Beyond that, there is this claim. There is the fruit and result of good and bad action. So that means that when you do something, there are consequences of that. When you do something loving, there are good consequences of that. When you do something hateful, there harmful consequences of that. The Buddha is saying that that is how it works. That's how it works if you believe that's how it works, and it's how it works if you don't believe that's how it works. This is really how it goes. You do something, it changes things, which changes the options for what we can do. And then we do the next thing within that, and then the next thing. And all of that is a creative act. And the fact that we are part of that production doesn't mean that it's not real. That is happening. Beyond that, he claims there is this world. Now, this is something which nowadays has somehow come into doubt. But in fact, even at the time of the Buddha, there were lots of teachers who were saying this isn't real, this doesn't matter, it's just an illusion, don't worry about it. There were other teachers who said the reason that it doesn't matter is that it's deterministic, so you're not really engaging in it at all. There were others who said it doesn't matter what you do because there isn't really any good and bad. There has been very little creativity, actually, over the past 2,500 years in the philosophical views on offer. What we see now existed then, and the Buddha responded to these claims by saying it's not true. There is this world. There are fruits and results of good and bad actions. There is such a thing as giving of yourself, as sacrificing in a heroic way that makes a difference. And also, don't think that there's no other world. There is a spiritual dimension. There is a world beyond this. So this world is real. The other world, the spiritual world, is real. He goes further. There is mother. There is father. Now, of course, this means you have a physical mother who gave birth to you. You have a father who offered the seed for that birth. Of course, there is that. Your mother and father gave birth to you. But more than that, your mother and your father love you. This is a real thing. They don't only care for you because you reproduce them, because that way they can continue on in this world after they die. They're not just using you in order to maintain their existence. On the contrary, there is such a thing as them really sacrificing for you that actually matters in a way beyond any kind of selfishness. Beyond that, the two of them could create you, this sacred being, because of being drawn together. There is mother and father. There is love in that direction as well. And beyond that, there is this more cosmic force of motherly love and of fatherly love. There is mother and father is an enormous claim of inspiration and joy. Beyond that, there are beings who are reborn spontaneously. Now, this, of course, affirms rebirth. You die and pass on. It also affirms that there are non-physical beings. Beyond that, there are good and virtuous philosophers and priests. So spiritual practitioners. There is such a thing as a group of good and virtuous people who are right here in the world. And they have directly realized this world, the Dharma, and they correctly explain it. So there are good teachers. All of these claims right now are under attack in the world. And unfortunately, they're under attack right within Buddhism. And because of that, Buddhism becomes an impoverished tradition in which we just try to reach some kind of apathy And there's the sense if you can have enough apathy, then you're enlightened. And so this talk right now is about how do we get there? How did this happen? It's not that Buddhism is dead by any means. There's real Buddhism. I was very fortunate to train under great masters. There are good and virtuous Buddhists who have realized this world and teach it, who realize the other world and teach it. And yet here we are with a kind of Western post-colonial Buddhism that is impoverished of its most vibrant life. And so I'd like to point out something rather surprising, and that is that most Buddhists in the world don't meditate. Now consider that. In the West, we think of meditation as being the core of Buddhist practice, but most Buddhists don't meditate. And why? Because it's not the core of Buddhist practice. On the contrary, ethics, which is to say morality, love, compassion, service, this is the core of Buddhist practice. Seeing things correctly, aspiring to live a life in accord with that, and then taking action. In fact, I don't know of a single example in the sutras when the Buddha taught meditation to anyone who hadn't proven that they were able to live a virtuous life in accord with right view, in accord with what I just read. Again, this is surprising to most people nowadays, because of the sense that meditation is the beginning, the middle, and the end of Buddhism. Instead, meditation is an important part of Buddhism. It's one part of the Eightfold Path. But it is not the central aspect. It is something that occurs naturally once we have carefully cultivated our lives. In fact, when someone wanted to enter the Buddhist Sangha, they were investigated as to their view. And if they held wrong view, which we discussed earlier, if that's how they saw things, the world isn't real, it doesn't matter, you can't really make a difference, there isn't really love, I don't believe anyone's actually realized enlightenment, even if they are a guru, they're not actually kind, and I don't know about all these right views. If someone was like this, then they were on probation for 3 months until they had proven that they had adopted right view. So that's where we started. And then something changed over the past few hundred years. And the place that I'd like to point is colonialism. Colonialism was traumatic for Buddhism. It was traumatic for the world, and it was traumatic for Buddhism. And Buddhism realized that it needed to adapt to the conquerors. So just very briefly, let me put us into the context of Buddhism entering the modern era. Consider that India, the place of the Dharma's birth, the place where the Buddha offered his teachings in the Ganges Valley, India had been under the direct control of the British, and for quite a long time, as we entered this modern era, India was run by a company, by a for-profit corporation. The Buddhists in India, the Buddhists in that region and neighboring countries such as Burma, also colonized, were very aware that they had lost control of their world to some distant island of pale-skinned people, and to the views that underlie the corporation. Consider Japan. Let's look at Japan as well. I trained in India for a few years, trained in Japan for several years. Let's look at Japan. Japan, entering this modern era, they said, we don't want anything to do with this. We're going to become an isolationist territory. And then the US sent warships under Commodore Perry and said, you don't have any choice. You must participate in the colonial era. They said, briefly, that they said no. But unfortunately, they did, yes. They realized the only way to not get colonized is to colonize. And so they fought back. And what happened next? Well, Tokyo was firebombed in acts that killed the most people in a single day in all of military history. Most of those people were women and children, and the vast majority were civilians. Then they had an atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima, Nagasaki. And in both areas, India, Japan, but other areas as well, there was a shock and a realization we must offer something that these conquerors will accept, or this will all be destroyed. It's important to put ourselves in the shoes of the traumatized as they are trying to figure out how to respond to the circumstances, because they were facing a force that was clear that it would eat everything. It will turn everything to the ends of this colonial or economic growth model. What are we going to do? Well, it's also important to note that during this same era, Buddhism had actually contributed a lot to the production of the modern world. The area which is probably most important to discuss is the area of psychology. As Buddhism has been the main contributor to modern Western psychology ever since the beginning of modern Western psychology. Freud and Jung and others were very familiar with Buddhist texts, in particular the Theravadan texts and the Yogacara texts. And they saw something there, which the West hadn't seen as of yet. They saw a systematic study of causality in the subconscious. So one of the things that Buddhism has excelled at is the study of causality. One of the things that Buddhism has been most expert in the world is the discovery, if you want to call it that, which is often what it has been called, the quote discovery, sort of like discovering how Columbus discovered the New World. In the same way, you could sort of say that they discovered the subconscious, something that shamans have known about since the beginning of humanity. But they, quote, discover the subconscious. They apply causality to the study of the impressions, the samskaras, functioning in our subconscious. And that is done in order to attain liberation. But certain people, such as Freud, Bernays, Skinner, use this not in order to bring about liberation, but instead in order to produce a vast system of psychological control. So Buddhism has seen, oh, look, we actually have something we can offer these people that they want, but it's not going well. So what are we going to do? And at this point, we come to some of the great creative figures in the history of the tradition. I was ordained in the Zen school. I'll talk about that first. Nowadays, when you think about Zen, one of the main aspects of the tradition that we consider is the 1 week retreat. It's what we call it. That's in Japanese, it's called an ozeshin or a daiseshin. So you go to a 1 week Zen retreat. It seems like the essence of Zen. It's like, what else would you do if you were going to practice Zen? You're going to go to your local meditation center occasionally and sit for an hour. But really what you're going to do is sit for a 1 week retreat. The 1 week retreat is a new invention in the history of Zen. It's not a normal thing to do. Meditation retreats traditionally have been roughly 90 days long, and only for people who have established themselves as highly ethical, deeply compassionate beings who are accomplished in the intellectual study of Buddhism. Only those people would be appropriate to enter such a retreat. But the Zen masters in Japan realized with this new world that they had to offer something that the colonialists would want. Their property was being taken by the US forces, redistributed. The teachings that they were giving were seen as the reason that Japan had fought the war in the first place. And so they realized we have to bring these people in. They don't seem that interested in most of what we do. And yet they do seem interested in meditation. And so they discovered that they could offer that. Another person, and the person who we should probably talk about the most, is S.N. Goenka, Goenka, an incredible creative force. And he has created one of the great meditation systems of the modern era and has helped many people. He is originally from Burma, but he made a great deal of money in India. He was a businessman in India, and he saw what colonialism was doing, and he took it upon himself to find some way to use his great mind and his great resources in order to provide Buddhism to the world and keep it alive and make the world a better place. One of the things that he discovered was that if you downplay ethics, of course, he still has ethics. He still says this is important, but he has changed the emphasis dramatically. You can enter a meditation retreat without first demonstrating right view, without first demonstrating that you've changed your livelihood in accord with that, without first making sacrifices. Enter the retreat. It's fine. We want to welcome people. He welcomed people, and then he provided a way to go very deep into meditation without the kind of study that had been traditional for thousands of years. As I say, it's helped people, but there is a great danger in this. And I'd suggest that while he took great care himself, nonetheless, a certain amount of insincerity was allowed into the system. a certain amount of skipping steps. And this was argued about. The various people who did this, the Zen masters, Goenkaji, even Mahasi Sayadaw, they were providing a certain kind of creativity, but other more traditional masters of Buddhism argued against it and said, if you do this, once you go down that road, and again, none of these people are saying be unethical. None of them are saying the world is meaningless. Not at all. But they change the emphasis. They change the way that the practice is done enough that other teachers are arguing and saying this is too dangerous. If you give this to the modern world, they're just going to take it and run with it and become monsters. They're just going to adapt it to whatever nefarious aims their economic system has. So look out. What happens then? What do we see happen? Well, we see that everyone was right. We see that Goenka, the Zen folks, were extremely successful in impacting the world. We see that, in fact, their systems are probably the most popular spiritual systems among the most powerful people on earth right now. So they did it. They did the thing that they tried to do, which is incredible. And in doing that, they gave us a great opportunity. They gave us an opportunity to have a positive impact on the minds of the people and the systems that have the most power in the world. So that's wonderful. Unfortunately, they also did create systems that fell into the traps that their opponents, their philosophical opponents, warned us of. More and more people who have done meditation retreats have the sense that it's the meditation that matters and you can still live however you want. I was speaking with a major meditation researcher in Silicon Valley. She interviewed me and she asked me for my definition of enlightenment. And I said, enlightenment means that you can live in an ethical and loving way no matter the circumstances. And she said, what? I've never heard anything about ethics among all of the people who I've interviewed. I've interviewed many Buddhist teachers. None of them have said that. Do you have anything to substantiate this absurd claim? She was mad. She was actually angry on the call. And I said, well, yes, I have a great deal to substantiate that. The Buddhist sutras, all of our entire tradition I have to support this. And she wasn't interested anymore. And that was it. And she went back and her reasoning was clear. She stated explicitly. She said, no, enlightenment means that you can be happy independent of conditions. How you behave are just conditions. So Buddhism, the purpose of Buddhism is to be sure that you can be happy even while you're doing bad things. Another story. I was at a symposium this past summer, a wonderful symposium with some very good friends, very wise friends. And they said many wise things. But eventually it came time for me to say something. And I pointed out that the most important thing in the world right now is practice. And the reason that the world is moving toward omnicide, the basic reason we're in a meta crisis is that we're not practicing. And one of these very wise individuals sitting just to my right disagreed and said, what are you talking about? These people, these leaders of tech companies, they meditate every day. They're practicing, and yet they're doing all of this harm. And what this pointed out to me is that we've lost track of what practice is. Practice doesn't mean that you meditate for 10 minutes a day. Now, part of practice may be that you meditate for 10 minutes a day. Certainly. Practice means that you make sacrifices for the benefit of all beings. That you believe that there's meaning in that you express your love for all beings, and then you realize, sadly, I can't. I want to be more loving, and I can't. I either behave in ways that I'm ashamed of, or I just fake it. I just fake the love. It's not the true love that's coursing through the entire universe, and therefore through my eyes and my ears, through my speech and my actions. It's not the real thing. And then through the deep concern that we're not living the teaching, we realize, oh, it's because of the deep underlying tendencies of my mind. Is there any tool that would allow me to go deep into these impressions built up over so long due to my actions? Is there anything that could allow me to go deep down and dislodge that? And then we realize, oh, yes, there is. It's called meditation. But meditation then is couched in the context of compassion with the purpose of realizing wisdom. Wisdom does not mean that you say, nothing matters. Wisdom doesn't mean that you say, no one's there. On the contrary, wisdom means that you so deeply experience love that you can't contain it to any kind of self whatsoever. You're taken beyond all of these fixations, not by going against this right view that we discussed. Too many people have the sense that the Buddha said, there is no such thing as this world. What you do doesn't matter. Having seen that what you do matters, you meditate. And you go beyond that by going deeper into it. This matters so much right now because Buddhism has been very influential in the world. Of course, you can go back a couple thousand years, 1,500 years, and at that point, probably Buddhism was the most popular religion in the world. Probably it was the most influential philosophical system on earth. But even if you set all that aside and you just look at the past few hundred years, past 100 years, 150 years, Buddhism has had such an influence on modern psychology, on the development of the sorts of indoctrination that we've engaged in through public relations and such, that you could still say that it's one of the most influential philosophical systems in the world. And that means that we have to take responsibility for this world. And one of the main problems that we've seen, which has been a problem for spiritual systems throughout the world, is that when you compromise something to make it more accessible, you run the risk of it being turned, twisted into something that is harmful. This is always the confusing uncertainty. Before we get involved, before we jump into this crisis, it seems like everything should be clear. It seems like it's all so simple. Everything should just be good and perfect. But then you get involved in the crisis and you realize we have to make these subtle judgment calls. We're going to have to adapt and then it's more accessible. But that means, unfortunately, that it may be appropriated by insincere intentions, or simply by naive ignorance. People who just don't know that there's a depth to the tradition. I bring this up right now in this conversation because Yuval Harari, who I greatly respect, I really appreciate what he's done, much of his work, his impact on me, on this community, has been very positive. But as he himself points out in the books, he couldn't have done any of it if it weren't for Goenka's system. He is, for better or worse, interesting to many people because he's the first major Western intellectual who is Buddhist. And he brings a certain flavor of Buddhism, a certain type of Buddhism, Goenka's type of Buddhism. And that type of Buddhism has strengths. It's incredibly popular, incredibly effective. However, the weakness of the system is that since it de-emphasizes ethics, meaning, right view, right aspiration, and the others, right speech, right action, right livelihood, since it de-emphasizes these, people who enter that system are more likely to misunderstand the whole teaching. And then that teaching that is given is both all the more accessible to people in the modern age. It's very accessible. You don't have to change your ideas about things. You can still think the world is meaningless and practice Buddhism, which makes it even more popular. So it's even more accessible. And we start going down this slippery slope. It's why the Buddha was so careful to say, you don't practice meditation until you have demonstrated right view through your actions. And again, right view, there is such a thing as making heroic sacrifice. That's a real thing. There's such a thing as cause and effect. What you do matters. There's such a thing as mother, father, love. There is this world. There's the other world. There are people who have realized that and correctly teach it. I summarize all of this as simply, there is the sacred. It is that realization that holds us as we go deep into, for example, meditation, so that we come out of it not as a psychopath, but instead as a compassionate sage. And the warning has been given for 1,500 years, since in China, they first started playing this game. That if you fall too far and slip down that slope, you will create monsters with this practice. So I recommend to Yuval Harari, to all of us here, that we are willing to fully examine the true teaching, the depths of the Buddhist tradition, to the extent that it allows us to make sacrifices. It allows us to experience deep love. It allows us to love this world. It allows us to realize this world, and it allows us to correctly proclaim it for the benefit of all beings.
All right.
So I could have gone on and on. I have many more notes here. I have probably about an hour more of material, but I want to
come back again. We're just
be a
getting
little
started.
quick because, well, I also just thought maybe there are some questions. I don't know if there's time for questions or if we have to finish here. Mark, what do you think?
We're not going to do a Q&A now, but we'll come back there's a context and a form to One Mountain, so it'll continue, right?
Great.
in its traditional form. As you know the importance of forms. But we will come back, and I would just say to everyone, this is part one of this conversation, an unbelievably important part one. So after you finish, we'll go to the next ritual step and conclusion. But what a gorgeous and critical, opening in part one, just completely, wildly beautiful and important. You were gonna conclude? You had a couple of you were gonna.
Oh yes, the last thing I'll say is that in terms of Buddhism as a whole, there are many different types, and one type of Buddhism, which is a completely valid approach, is the sense I want to gain liberation for myself. I want to resolve my suffering. This is completely valid. If you wish to do that, you must behave ethically, caringly, you must realize right view, and you must bring it forth as compassion. There is another approach, which you might call the Mahayana. That means that you want everyone to resolve their suffering, that you take on that personal responsibility to directly help. Now, obviously, even if all you want is your own liberation, you still have to want everyone to benefit, to receive the teachings, the care needed in order to walk the path. But in the Mahayana, you will take personal responsibility that everyone receives that. And then holding everyone in that compassionate light, you are motivated to walk the path yourself. Very good. There's another approach, which is also valid. Both of these are valid, and the third is valid as well. That is to say, the Vajrayana, which means I will make every part of my life the practice. Now, every part includes everything. It even includes things like war or sex or these deep questions around truth and falsehood. I appreciate all of these. I have some experience with all of them, although the least with the Vajrayana, the third. But here we practice a fourth type, which is called the Navayana, which was developed mostly by an Indian man named Ambedkar, named Bhimrao Ambedkar. Now, this Navayana says something absolutely radical. It says that we're going to go even further than that. We're going to bring society to enlightenment. We're going to practice in such a way that the whole society realizes awakening. The whole society practices these ethics, for example, not destroying life. So here we emphasize the societal practice, and that means that the society, the civilization, must realize at least the first precept of Buddhism, which is do not destroy life. That's the beginning of the path. The civilization has to come to the place where we as a civilization don't destroy life. And then we as a civilization can walk a spiritual path through ethics, meditation, wisdom to enlightenment. That enlightenment isn't, again, saying there's no such thing as a world. Instead of that, it means that we have actually brought together worldly aims, worldly concerns with the absolute. This, bringing these together, weaving them together, this is not something to be ashamed of. This is not a bad thing to do. This is a miraculous, a marvelous, a heroic thing to do. And all of us here should be proud that we're striving to practice a deep path of spirituality so that we can see reality, we can become love, we can act that way in the world while directly meeting the crises of this age.
Amen.
What could be more beautiful? And so I'm very happy to be with us in this community, you, Marc, all of you, as we take that courageous step together.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, brother. And I just want to say just two very short things. And it's all so beautiful and so important. And the reason, we're going to end here and we're going to chant and conclude as we always do. But I want everyone kind of catch this really, really carefully. So the way we began is we cited my friend Yuval, who basically says, I want to get it really clearly. He says it quite clearly, right? And I gave the direct quotes, but I want you to kind of feel it because we have to wield Manjushri's sword so carefully here with so much precision, because we are now in this second affecting what the lineage masters of Solomon call a tikkun, a fixing, right? We're evolving the source code. We're correcting a distortion in the field. The force has gotten weak. The field is distorted. And we're correcting the claim that says that suffering, and this is Yuval's equation, it's very direct and clear. I'm not putting any words in his mouth. He's representing, in his understanding, he's representing the Goenka tradition. And he says suffering is connected with thinking there's meaning. That's exactly how he says it, right? So if you now let go of meaning, you've now accomplished the Buddha's goal of letting go of suffering. And again, any meaning, right, or any goal, he uses the word any twice in different books. And in both cases, he italicizes them. And you all might notice I'm a careful reader. So it uses any twice and italicizes them both, meaning don't get confused. I'm not sure there's any meaning. And then he writes children's books and teaches that to the next generation. Right? And what Soryu has said so beautifully, and I won't recapitulate him, his words stand by themselves. I just want to take one sentence that he said, which is essentially, there is the sacred, right? In other words, and he wasn't saying there is the sacred in the way that, let's say, our colleague, who writes about attention, he wrote a book called The Anxious Generation, Jonathan Haidt. So Jonathan talks about attention, but Jonathan just says, but I'm only borrowing that word like Emil Durkheim does, because he calls it homo duplex. There's got to be a level of the sacred, but it's not real. He says, I'm an atheist. There is no real meaning, but let's use the word the sacred because we'll borrow it even though we don't mean it. That's not what Soryu is saying. What he's saying is that the depth, right, of Buddhist initiation into reality is this realization of meaning, right, as inherent, intrinsic. Right? And I just want to notice what Soryu began with everyone. What he said it intuitively. He said, you can take heroic action. I remember that in the beginning, which is so beautiful. We've talked a lot here about heroism. And Yuval, I want you to get the direct context. Yuval, after he explains that actually to really do nothing means that the mind also does nothing and creates nothing, right? And he says, and you could be confused and you could do the following. Unfortunately, this too easily turns into a heroic epic. I mean, you could get confused and think you could be heroic. So what Yuval is doing is he's merging with the postmodern moment, which rejects the hero. Now, again, both Soryu and I agree that we need to problematize the hero. Of course we do. Of course, pre-modernity claimed heroic epics and false stories. And of course, we need the sharpness of Manjushri's sword in every mystical tradition, including Buddhism, to cut through false stories and idolater stories, which is why, for example, in the Ten Commandments, they read, don't take God's name in vain, meaning don't tell false stories in God's name. Of course, but Yuval's saying, I want everyone to get it. Yuval's saying more than that. He's saying on the other side of cutting through all the stories, there's nothing on the other side, right? And what Soryu is saying is, in his deep lineage study and as a master in Buddhism, he's saying, no, it all emerges from the sacred. And the sacred is not a made-up story. The sacred is the inherent nature of reality backed by the universe. So this is a very major, important cultural moment that was missing from our critique of evil, because it really could only be offered from within the lineage by a master within the lineage, right? And, a couple of people texted me and said, hey, both your picture, the picture on the screen is kind of you listening to Soryu. Let's make sure just to have, and I said, no, I want everyone to see that picture. We have to listen to each other. Right? We have to be in real conversation, right? We have to be excited about each other. I'm excited, right, that Soryu is doing this. It's so important. It's so wonderful, right? And that's this new emergence, this new possibility. So I just want to thank everyone. We're going to end with a chant. Thank you, Soryu. Thank you, everybody. Monde yani aleye fanecha monde yani aleye fanecha. I embrace my eye on the inside of God's face before she, as she. Monde ani elefanecha melechai vikayam. Monde ani elefanecha melechai vikayam. Monde ani elefanecha monde yani fanecha melechai v'kayam, king, queen, who's inherent in all of reality. In her arms we always fall. Melechai v'kayam shechazarta binishmati, you've breathed into me the breath of life. Rabba emunatecha, translated Rabba emunatecha, great is my trust in thee, God, and my trust in thee, she. But the same words translated, great is your infinite sacred, your trust in me. Rabba se emunatecha, Rabba se emunatecha, Rabba se emunatecha, Rabba emunatecha, Rabba se emunatecha, Rabba se emunatecha, Rabba se emunatecha, Rabba emunatecha. Oh, great is my trust in you, God, great is your trust in me, God, great is my trust in thee, she, great is your trust in me. Say, Rabba emunatecha, Rabba emunatecha, Rabba emunatecha, Rabba emunatecha. Krista.
Thank you, Dr. Marc Gafni. Thank you, Soryu. It's so beautiful to feel and be witnessing and feel that we are participating actually in this conversation that is so important and so eye-opening and heart-opening. Thank you so much for doing that and for sharing your wisdom with us today. And thanks to everyone for participating in the evolution of love together. It matters so much that we're here. There's one thing that we learned today is that it matters so much where we place our precious, precious, precious attention. So thank you. One other place where you can place your attention is this book, First Principles and First Values. It's a little book, easy to read. It's the core of the core of the core of the revolution. We also like to call it the tip of the spear. And you can find it as a paperback, but also as an audiobook, super easy to listen to on the road. And please, if you have, write a review on Amazon. That really helps the book explode into the world. The other thing, of course, I really want to ask everyone to do is, first of all, watch the podcast that Marc Gafni did with Aubrey Marcus. It's on his channel on YouTube, Aubrey Marcus, and enjoy the podcast, but also like it and leave a comment and be in conversation with the people there and spread your wisdom and your unique perspective and your love there. And if you can, please do take the link from the podcast and share it with as many people as you can. You can share it on your Facebook, your Instagram. There's also beautiful short reels on Marc Gafni's Instagram that you can share with the world. Or just write an email and say how this podcast moves you and why you deeply feel that being in this conversation with Yuval Harari matters so much, and that we actually need to tell a new story together. Send it to a couple of people that you know, but if you have an email list with 10 people, 50 people, 100 people, share it there as well. That would be so helpful to get this out into the world. And last but not least, in April, we're coming together in Europe. Finally, I can't wait. It's been a cold, long, lonely winter, but we get to feel each other again, be in the same room again. I mean, I love digital intimacy. We can already feel and touch each other. But being in the same room, dancing together, loving each other, hugging each other, studying and practicing deeply together, it's so valuable. So that's going to happen at Eros Mystery School, April 28th until May 2nd. We have Aubrey Marcus come in as a special guest partner, student of cosmoerotic humanism, lineage holder.